Well, what Ben was just alluding to was a fight that is going on in the, might call it the anti-aging community. That's an unsavory expression these days. The transhumanist movement, or the Humanity Plus movement, or the extropian movement, between those who still cling to the views of Aristotle, like Steve Coles, and Aubrey de Grey, who's going to have his shot in a second, and those like myself who are total apostates from that view. And everything I'm going to be talking about today sort of illustrates my point of view, which is derived from evolutionary theory and massive experiments. Nothing like the way medicine works. Hopefully that will become clear as I go along. I've actually worked on two things primarily over the last 35 years. I started to be dragged into this actually in 1975 by my advisor, Brian Charlesworth. And most people know only the first phase of my career, where I've worked on the evolution of aging, the postponement of aging, the physiology of postponed aging. But actually, since about 1995, my main interest has been the evolution of immortality and manipulations of immortality, which is the real, what would you call it, the deadly lion for the Aristotelian beast, which I will try to, again, explain today. But the main reason why I am engaged in my minor speaking tour of the last year is because I've thought up a new technology just in the last year or so, and I'm so excited about it, I want to share it with people. In 1984, I proposed the concept that we build a Methuselah mouse, in Aubrey de Grey's language, using evolutionary tools. And actually, after I made that proposal, it was in fact done on a pilot level, and the idea was shown to work using a strategy Greg Benford's already alluded to. I'm going to explain a little more detail. Then in 1999, when I'd spent 15 years failing to get that project properly started, I didn't have Aubrey de Grey's polemical skills, I thought of a faster route to transforming human life expectancies, the evolutionary genomic route from Methuselah flies, which I'd been building for some time, to human Methuselahs, and then that's the Genesian technology that Greg Benford was talking about. However, in the last year, I thought of a totally different technology. We're still working on what to call it. Right now, I'll just call it the Natural Immortality Plan. I'm very excited about this third one because the first proposal I thought up more than 25 years ago, I projected at the time would take at least 15 to 20 years to yield significant results. This plan, the Genesian plan, you're looking at a 3 to 10 year time frame, and we're well into that. But this third plan is something you can start this evening at no cost. You don't have to buy anything. In fact, you might save money with this third plan. So that's really what I'm doing and why I'm speaking to this forum. But to get you there, so you understand where I come from and why this is different from anything you've ever heard before, you have to understand some really basic things that are widely not understood. And I have to start off with some definitions. The first concept I need to explain to you is the concept of biological immortality, not the same thing as Greek immortality. You can die, but the idea here is that you are non-aging. Versus aging, which involves a declining survival likelihood under good conditions. And basically, I explain both of these phenomena using evolution by natural selection. Those who are creationists are free to disbelieve what I have to say, which is, I think, Aubrey's ultimate out on this whole thing. So here's a creosote bush not too far from the 15 freeway between Los Angeles and Las Vegas, and radioisotope dating dates it at more than 10,000 years old, where it's been growing in the Mojave Desert of California. There are other really long-lived organisms. There are fungi growing in Washington State that are the size of several football fields and are thousands of years old as well. And there are animals that don't age either. This is an example of fissile sea anemone. These are all cases where the reproductive system involves strict fission, splitting in two. no sexual reproduction, and under these conditions, a straightforward corollary of evolutionary theory shows you that natural selection favors immortality. And the fact that such a diversity of eukaryotic organisms can have indefinite lifespan shows you that there is precisely nothing about eukaryotic cell or molecular biology which requires an aging process. Okay? So despite all of the cell and molecular theories you ever heard about aging, there is nothing about having eukaryotic cells that requires aging in any way. This is why you are all aging. This is the force of natural selection acting on genes with proportional effects on adult survival. It stays very powerful in all the ages up until the first age of reproduction in a population. I'm not advocating celibacy, which will also, no doubt, make Aubrey feel better. And the force of natural selection then starts to fall from that age all the way to the last age of reproduction in the population, which is a very significant parameter, of course, one that Hugh Hefner works on assiduously. After this last age of reproduction, the force of natural selection stays at a plateau value that goes out to infinity, which will prove to be significant. So a corollary of that theory, and it's a very general mathematical corollary, is that we predict the aging of all strictly non-fissile organisms. If you can't reproduce by fission or a similar process, you are going to age. And when I'm talking about immortality here, I'm not talking about absolutely abolishing this process. I'm talking about both what happens after this process and tuning this process pragmatically. Starting in the late 1970s, I realized that the little b parameter, which was the first stage of reproduction of population, is the critical parameter for this process because it's that parameter which basically dictates when a population starts to go down the tubes. And when I had that insight in 1977, I thought, wow, what if I delay that little parameter b in an evolving population for a number of generations? The evolutionary theory I'm just sketching for you in pictures implies that aging should be slowed or postponed automatically by evolution after enough generations pass if you start with genetic variation, the usual stipulations of evolutionary biology. So because my advisor was away and I got to do this experiment, I started the first example, deliberate example at least, of this experiment, which is basically easily understood as the graduate school or medical school experiment, where you delay your reproduction in the biological sense, not in the social or hedonistic sense. These are organisms that are allowed to have all the sex they want, but we discard all of their eggs until we reach some threshold age. We push the little parameter b to a later age, and at that age we then allow these organisms to reproduce. And we do this generation after generation after generation. And again, Greg Benford already stole my thunder on this one. So again, the prediction is that that should produce longer-lived organisms. A little nomenclature: normal fruit fly reproduction only by young adults, we call selection regime B. This delayed reproduction lineage is called O, and in fact, these are replicated populations, which is a non-trivial thing for evolutionary genomics, which Ben might get into. So here you see actually halfway through this experiment, only about, it's about 15 years ago. This experiment's been going on for a little over 30 years. This particular one I'm showing you the data from, I did it all before in the 1970s on a smaller scale. But anyway, 15 years ago, here are male data from normally reproduced flies here, and here are data from males derived from the much delayed reproducers. And at that point in time, they're living about twice as long. And now we're somewhere between 3 and 5 times longer, depending on how you assay the flies. And similar results for females. This result showed that the type of theory that I've been talking about originally, derived by William Hamilton, is in fact the correct theory for evolutionary explanation of aging. It is not about species survival. Anybody who tells you stuff about species survival, they do not know what they're talking about. Non-trivially, in the history of gerontology, this was the first time it was ever possible to develop an exhaustive and general theory that could then be straightforwardly tested and pass the test. Unlike every other theory, all the cell and molecular theories all of which require special pleading exceptions and so on and so on. Totally unlike regular gerontology. That's what I was doing really up until the mid-90s. And then this woman came into my life, of whom you've already heard. The thing that amuses me most about her is the fact that she sold paintbrushes to Van Gogh in her hometown of Arles, France, in the critical period when Van Gogh lived with Gauguin and became the Van Gogh that you all know, with the sunflowers and the cut-off ear. So how and why was this possible? Because actually numerically it didn't make any sense whatsoever. Basically that woman should not have been alive but for this little demographic fact that if you were a speed reader of Steve Cole's inimitable slides, you might have picked up on. This is from very large-scale data, nothing like supercentenarian data, many, many more individuals in this data. And these are age-specific mortality rates. These happen to be little old English ladies. Data from the first half of the 20th century showing the stabilization of their age-specific mortality rates, which is why people are able to survive to become supercentenarians. Basically because the age-specific mortality rates stabilized. And this is taken from a forthcoming book, Does Aging Stop? A little plug here by myself, my good colleague Larry Muller, my former graduate student Cassie Rouser, where we go into a vast amount of detail on the phenomenon of late life immortality, which is the foundation of my talk today. So demographically speaking, aging stops in humans sometime in the 90s. So Steve Coles has already raised the issue of, well, what does that mean functionally? I'm going to get to that later. I'll have to save that. We looked at these data because of publications that appeared in 1992 with insects, published by Jim Carey and Jim Kurtzinger. These are data collected by Jim Kurtzinger from Drosophila. This is on a log scale, so this crudely linear piece is actually an exponential acceleration in death rates. Even better data were collected by Jim Carey in a gigantic facility in Mexico with medflies. And here what we have are a total of like 2 million flies dying. And what you see is this rapid acceleration in death rate, which you call aging, and this very prolonged period after that in which mortality rates stabilize, as in those little old English ladies. And later on, the numbers start to get completely crazy, which is thanks to the law of large numbers. When you're waiting for just a few individuals to die, then your data goes crazy, and it's really not scientific data anymore. It's anecdotal data. So that's what you're seeing in these data as they go crazy toward the end. It's not that they're becoming different biologically. It's that numerically the demography is destabilizing, which is very predictable in terms of the theory of random variables. So what you're seeing here demographically, we feel, is an unequivocal demonstration that demographically aging stops at sufficiently late ages. In fact, actually a very important paradox for the purpose of this talk is that it stops so late in humans. In fruit flies in our lab, aging can basically stop when only 50% of the adults have died, which is full of implications for you sitting in the audience today. So this is the death knell of the Gompertzian model quantitatively, which is also the death knell of the Aristotelian model, that aging starts and then just continues indefinitely until individuals are dead due to some cumulative damage or error process. That theory is, I think, definitively wrong, and I'm happy to argue with Aubrey about it in public. So parametrically, or just the numerical phenomenology of this, you're looking at a development period in life, you're looking at an aging period, the first part of adulthood, then you're looking at an immortal phase in which aging stabilizes, and that apparently can continue forever if you have a large enough cohort. So what does that mean in terms of evolutionary theory? When those results were first published, I actually doubted them, and I was still an Aristotelian at that time. I still believed in an aging process. But then I started thinking a little more seriously about this part of the curve, which I'm blowing up for you here, the part that Hugh Hefner works on, the last stage of reproduction in the population. And I thought, well, gee, after that, the force of natural selection actually stabilizes, and it does so forever. If there's any adaptation left at this point, that could potentially last forever. That was a verbal concept I had in my head. And of course, verbal concepts are worthless until you do some hardcore theory. Put graphically, my verbal concept was like this. If you invert the force of natural selection and plot it as the weakness of natural selection, you start off with very low weakness of natural selection, young people, strong force of natural selection. It then progressively increases, the weakness that is, until finally it stabilizes and remains stable indefinitely. That's what Hamilton's curve does when you invert it. So my colleague Larry Muller indulged me in the mid-90s by doing some simulations of what will actually happen to life history evolution over a long period of time in an indefinite demography. We did a whole bunch of different models. I have this talent for pestering Larry. And this is a typical simulation result. This is a formal calculation. This isn't real data, showing the aging pattern here and then the stabilization of aging later on. So basically, my guess about how the theoretical population genetics should work proved to be correct in explicit mathematical models under a wide variety of conditions. So I then, of course, being the experimentalist of the team, did some experimental evolution to see if, in fact, we could show that the transition from aging to late life could evolve in the way predicted by the theory. One thing I didn't show you is that the theory implies that if you shift the last age of reproduction around, you should shift the point at which you start the late life plateau. And this is stuff we published in 2002. And here you see one set of populations in blue having a late onset of late life, or the stabilization mortality, or what we call the immortal phase. And in yellow, you see an earlier attainment of the immortality plateau. And you can read that article for the details. So we have shown the following things. We have shown that aging stops demographically. We have shown that we can explain it evolutionarily, and we have, in fact, made it change using the tools of experimental evolution. So not only is there an immortal phase after the aging phase, the time at which you make the transition from aging to biological immortality is not fixed in an absolute way. This brings me to the purpose of my coming here and giving this talk, the natural immortality technology, which isn't simple or easy, but it's free and you can start it this evening. Oh, although I should point out, it will only work if you're over 35 or 40. So the young people in this audience don't bother, for reasons I hope I will explain shortly. So here's an idea I had very crudely in the early noughties, after having done the research I just described. The key thing really that you'd want to do is not slow the rate of aging, which actually numerically doesn't have a very big impact. What you'd really like to do is you'd like to stop the aging phase, you'd like to cut it off and go directly to the immortal phase at a lower rate of mortality, which is what, in fact, fruit flies do, relative to humans as a proportion of their life cycle. And then once you'd cut the aging process off earlier, you'd then like to use medical tools like radical repair to then converge on a flatter and flatter overall curve with lower and lower mortality levels. So that's the overall strategy. And when I first had this graphical idea again, I had no idea of how you might do this. And for an organism living in its natural environment to which it has evolved, in which it has evolved for millions of years, in fact, I don't think there's any easy way to do this. But that actually is not a description of human biology. This actually, I'm going to move this slide next time I give this talk. Steve Coles raised the point, well, what is it like out there on the demographic plateau? This is what it's like. This is from a paper we have under review. My graduate student Parveen Jawarstani obtained these data. Time spent in motion, ability of the fly to move around, a functional character, steadily declines during the aging phase. You then go to the late life phase when the age-specific mortality rates have stabilized, Steve, and you see that that function is basically stabilized and stays flat during the flat demographic period. And the general pattern is that there is no pattern. Some characteristics do continue to deteriorate, although often at a slower rate during late life. Other characteristics may slightly improve and some stabilize. So it turns out that functionally being biologically immortal is quite complex. It's unlike aging, in which everything goes to hell. During the aging phase, essentially all functions are going down, but in the immortal phase, you have stabilization. So the question is, in our experiments, when we look at the transition from aging to biological immortality, does that depend on your lifestyle? And the short answer is yes. We've done a lot of experiments on this when we weren't even thinking about this. Turns out the timing of when you make the transition from aging to late life depends on things like your food, your lifestyle, especially your sex life, and even your choice of mate. So that raises the question, this is the all-important question for today, what would be the right lifestyle for humans who want to stop their aging sooner, right? Okay, if you followed me this far, you realize this is the all-important question. So the key is, what is natural for humans? What are we best adapted to? What's our best environment? Now, we know unequivocally from all kinds of epidemiological evidence, this is not the industrial lifestyle with lots of sugar, lots of immobility, lots of stress, watching news programs, having your stock portfolio get fried by the psychopaths on Wall Street. None of that is good for your health or survival at any age. You're left with two main contenders, and many of you will have heard about this. One is the agricultural lifestyle, lots of whole grains, relatively little meat, relatively little fat, versus the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And I'm actually going to give you a tricky answer to this question. Now, some people think, oh, like, you know, Andrew Weil's sort of a proponent of this first one, and a whole bunch of people I've just been learning about recently are proponents of this one. Both are wrong, both are right. So as an experimental evolutionist, actually, I've been working for a long time with some very good colleagues in Portugal on this precise question of how fast populations adapt to novel environments. We've been, if you're of Eurasian ancestry, basically your ancestors were adapting to the agricultural environment over the last 12,000 years or so, which is some hundreds of generations. So we do experiments like this where we change environments on organisms and we watch how fast they adapt phenotypically and genetically. And it turns out with intense selection, you can get pretty fast adaptation in less than 100 generations, often as little as 30 to 60 generations. That implies that Andrew Weil is right, that Eurasian ancestry populations should generally be adapted to agricultural lifestyles with grains, daily manual labor, moderately high population densities, although it's no comfort to people whose ancestry has no agricultural component, no agricultural selection. They should switch to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle right away. They should never be in an agricultural lifestyle, but there are not a whole lot of you like that here today. But there's a trick to this whole story. And that is that Hamilton's forces of natural selection, the force I gave you the little cartoon of earlier, scale the speed of domestication or adaptation to a novel environment with chronological age during adulthood. And Larry Muller did a nice slide for this concept. Here you have adult age like this. Here you have the ideal ancestral phenotype. It's just some arbitrary curve here. And then the top curve is the most fit phenotype in a new environment that the population has been able to adapt to in a normal fashion with a variety of ages of reproduction during adulthood. For some hundreds of generations, this will be the result. The result is that at early ages, you will be fairly well adapted to the newish environment, the environment you might have had for 100 or more generations, but not 10,000 generations. But at later ages, you will lose that adaptation to the novel environment, and you will revert to a condition in which you are better adapted to your long ancestral environment before you made the transition to agriculture. Now, when I figured this out, I was like totally excited because of actually some data that Steve showed earlier. And that is, we hit late life immortality plateaus very late in life in our 90s. In your 80s, you're still aging. And we do so in terrible condition. But there are all kinds of good reasons, theoretically, to expect that hunter-gatherer populations are more like my fruit flies that hit immortality plateaus quite early, that in fact they might hit their transition from aging to late life immortality perhaps in their 50s or 60s, and do so in better shape. Among the reasons for that, most importantly, is simply a much larger population size was characteristic of agricultural populations compared to hunter-gatherer populations. When that occurs, natural selection reaches deeper into your future and generates more aging. When you have an early likelihood of death from somebody's spear in the back or because you can't cope with an acute bacterial or viral infection, and you as the typical hunter-gatherer, that leads to an earlier transition from aging to late life from the calculations that Larry Muller has done. Other factors that suggest much better condition on the plateau with the hunter-gatherer lifestyle is a much longer evolutionary history in that environment, which will favor age-independent beneficial substitutions, we call them in evolutionary biology, which will make you generally better adapted to that long ancestral environment. And then homicide probably helped as well. Homicide rates are much higher in the Garden of Eden than they are even in Chicago or Detroit. So what this suggests is adopting the hunter-gatherer lifestyle after 40 years of age if you're Eurasian, and to the extent to which you have less Eurasian ancestry or less agricultural ancestry, even earlier. And then using the best of modern medicine to lower your mortality level during that plateau. Just because you're on a plateau doesn't mean you can't get cancer, you can't get heart disease, but now we have all these smart MDs running around trying to patch that damage up. If you have the health of a contemporary 45-year-old, you'd be much better able to survive heart surgery and the extirpation of a lot of tissue if you're a cancer patient than you would at the age of 95, right? 95 radical surgery is basically going to be fatal. And then autologous tissue repair is coming down the turnpike really soon in wide availability. That will still further depress the overall mortality level for those who are on a good and healthy plateau. And then newer generation of pharmaceuticals, which is, I hope, part of the future of Genesiant, with fewer side effects, will be available in 10 or more years. With this recipe, I feel many of you could be alive basically indefinitely. And I'd like to thank a bunch of sponsors for my research and my colleagues, the key colleagues, the many students in my lab, Larry Muller, Cassie Rosser, Gita Metosh, and Parveen Sharastani. Thank you very much.